Okay, folks, continuing on in our adventure in the lore of business organizations, this recording is going to deal with Note 3, the liability of agents to third parties and the termination of agencies. I'm not sure if we'll have this all in one section or two. It'll probably end up being two sections, so I assume this will be eventually called Part 1. All right. One of the biggest issues in terms of agency situations, and even with employees to a certain extent, is something called scope of authority. Now, authority means that the principal has given the agent certain duties or tasks to perform and has also given them certain powers to do things on behalf of the principal. A big question comes into how broad or how narrow is that power. And the legal term we use for this is called scope, coming from the idea of a telescope or a periscope, in that particularly with a telescope, the further away you're trying to look, the wider the angle that you're looking at, the broader the picture that you're seeing. So an agent's authority to do things on behalf of their principal, it can be very narrow, it can be very closely defined for one activity in one situation on one day, or it could be very broad into go out and look for good deals for me and enter into contracts on my behalf, pay down payments on my behalf, and this authority may roll along for weeks or months or years, depending on the agreed upon relationship between the principal and the agent. And again, remember, this gets complicated because the agreement, the arrangement between the principal and the agent is not always expressly stated. It's not always in writing. Sometimes it comes into being by implication, by their actions, and sometimes it changes and evolves over a course of time, whereby somebody may have been hired to be an agent for one particular purpose, and then a second time or a third time, and then eventually just starts looking for deals and looking for things that they think the principal might like, and the principal goes along with this, and little by little, without the parties really giving much thought to it, the scope of the agent's authority begins to grow bigger and bigger and bigger as the principal comes to trust them and let them do more and more things on the behalf of the principal. This becomes critical in a few areas. First and foremost, it becomes critical in terms of what is the principal bound to and not bound to. It becomes critical for the agent in terms of what will they be compensated for or not compensated for. It becomes critical to third parties who are trying to figure out, well, what exact authority did this agent have? Were they allowed to enter into this agreement they made with me on behalf of the principal? And it gets even more difficult because going back to Roman times, built into the law is the idea of vicarious liability. Vicarious liability means that if you are an employer, if you are a principal of an agent, and you send somebody out to work on your behalf to make money for you, and they happen to injure someone, or they damage someone's property, or they breach a contract with someone, you as the principal can be held liable. You can be held responsible for the actions of your employee or your agent. So therefore, it becomes very critical to determine, was an agent or was an employee acting within the scope of their duties, and therefore the principal becomes responsible, or was this situation with a third party something that was detached and not part of the agency agreement, not part of their employment duties, and therefore even though an injury was caused, the principal is not responsible, or the employer is not responsible for it. Very critical subjects, very critical things where hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars, can be at stake for the principal, for the corporation that the principal represents or that the agent is working for. So it becomes a very, very important and very often litigated issue. All right. When we are trying to figure out what is the scope of authority of an agent, there are a few things that we need to know. Number one, that authority can be expressly stated in writing, and that writing then shown to a third party to show exactly what authority the agent has and what their limits are. The document that we use to do this is something called a power of attorney. A power of attorney is a document whereby you appoint someone to do actions on your behalf as if they were you. And depending on what is written in the document, that often includes signing contracts, signing deeds, signing other types of things that would then become binding upon the principal, and the principal would then be liable for. I have uploaded several types of powers of attorney to the handout section of Blackboard, so you guys can go and look at them and see what they look like. There are general, just as there is with agency relationships, there are general powers of attorney which cover all types of transactions and are meant to run indefinitely. They can exist for years and years and years. There are very specific and limited powers of attorney. Very often, as a lawyer who does real estate as a large part of my practice, I end up going to closings for people, for clients who don't want to or cannot attend on their own. And for those situations, we draw up a very specific power of attorney that basically gives me authority to go to this closing, to sign documents according to the terms that have already been laid out in the purchase and sales agreement or purchase and sales contract, and to make sure that any and all funds are conveyed to the principals forthwith. That power of attorney exists only for that one transaction. It only allows me to do the things involved in that transaction. Having the agency relationship in writing, creating powers of attorney that can be shown to third parties are very important ways of making sure that everything is kept clear, kept orderly. But of course, as the world is, most business people don't bother to be that particular. They don't bother to go into that detail unless you're starting to work as maybe a sales rep for some of the larger corporations. Having had bad experiences over the years, they have very, very tightly written agency and sales representative agreements expressly detailing what their agents can and cannot do, and they will freely send those on to third parties so that the third party will know the extent of the agent's power and scope of their authority. When we are doing, particularly in real estate, something called the equal dignity rule comes into play when we're dealing with agency and agents' authorities. The equal dignity rule says that if a writing is required to do this transaction, then the agent's authority must be in writing. It further says that if a document needs to be notarized, the agent's authority needs to be in writing and notarized. And in real estate, any of you who have taken it will know that in order to conduct real estate transactions, mortgages and deeds have to be signed. They have to be notarized to be valid and to be able to be recorded in the recording system. So therefore, anyone who's being appointed an agent to work on someone's behalf to buy and sell their real estate, the party on the other side is going to demand a written power of attorney, notarized, signed by the principal, and specifically stating that this person has the power to sign deeds, mortgages, whatever needs to be done to make the transaction happen. In the business world of buying and selling, of